What do you say to a woman with a rope already fitted to her neck? Nothing, because the truth that changes everything is riding into town right now, and it is riding slow on a gray horse, in no hurry at all, though it carries 11 years of silence that will run out before sunup. By dawn, Whitlock Springs, Arizona Territory, would either watch a widow hang for a murder she never committed, or watch its most respected citizen unmasked as the man who actually pulled the trigger. Her name was Temperance Holt. She had roughly 11 hours left to live, and she did not yet know that the stranger camped a half-mile outside of town had spent 11 years carrying the one fact that could save her. Stay with this one all the way through, because the reversal in this story is not the kind you'll see coming in the first 10 minutes. Like this video and subscribe to the channel if these stories keep you up past your bedtime the way they do us. And let's go back. Back, past the trial, past the arrest, back to the day Temperance Holt buried her husband. Because that is where all of this truly started 2 years before a rope was ever measured for her neck. Thomas Holt had been a decent man, not a rich one. He had scraped 80 acres of grazeland out of the hard country east of the Whitlock Hills, built a cabin with his own hands, and married a preacher's daughter from Tucson who had more grit in her than half the men who came courting her before him. Temperance had chosen Thomas Holt over 3 other suitors with better prospects because he made her laugh on a porch swing in the rain, and because he never once dictated what she could or couldn't do with her own 2 hands. For 6 years, that was enough. Then a spring fever swept the valley, took 11 souls with it, and Thomas was one of them. Grief alone might have broken a weaker woman. Temperance buried her husband on a Tuesday, and by Thursday she was back out mending fence, because the ranch did not know how to mourn, and neither, she decided, would she not where anyone could see it. What she could not outwork, though, was the mortgage Thomas had taken 2 winters before, a modest loan against a hard season, held not by a bank but by a private note in the hands of a man named Silas Vane. The land itself demanded something of a person that town gossip never fully accounted for. The Whitlock Hills sat low and stubborn against the horizon, more color than shape at sunrise, and the 80 acres Thomas Holt had claimed beneath them held water where most claims that far east held only rock and disappointment. Temperance had grown up believing a woman's worth was measured out in patience and a quiet mouth. 6 years married to a man who thought otherwise had taught her a different measure entirely. And by the time she stood alone at his grave, she was no longer the soft-spoken preacher's daughter Whitlock Springs remembered arriving. She simply hadn't yet met anyone in this new life who needed reminding of that. Neighbors who came to pay respects that first winter left commenting, not always kindly, on how dry-eyed she seemed at the graveside, as though grief were a performance she'd declined to give for their benefit. What they mistook for coldness was closer to arithmetic, a woman doing the sums on how many seasons a person alone could hold 80 acres against debt, drought, and a mercantile owner's patient smile. Vane ran the mercantile, the freight office, and, quietly, through paper most of the valley never saw, nearly a third of the debt in Whitlock Springs. He was soft-spoken, always correctly dressed, and he had a way of speaking to widows that made grief sound like an opportunity he was generously willing to overlook. In the 2 years after Thomas died, Vane paid a call on Temperance Holt 11 times. 11, she counted them, the way you count things you're trying not to feel. Each visit he raised the interest a little, extended the note a little, and reminded her, gently, that a woman alone could not be expected to hold 80 acres against the winter forever. Each visit he mentioned, more directly than the last, that there was a simpler arrangement available to her, one that involved his name replacing her husband's on the deed, and, eventually, in the house. Refused him in April with tea gone cold on the table between them. Refused him in August with her hand resting, not quite by accident, near the shotgun by the door. By the autumn before this story begins, Silas Vane had stopped pretending the offer was a kindness. He announced, in front of 2 of his hired men, that the note would come due in full come spring, and that a widow who couldn't pay it would find herself with considerably fewer choices than she currently believed she had. The town watched this happen and stayed silent. That is the part that matters most, so hold on to it. Whitlock Springs watched a respected man corner a grieving widow for 2 straight years, and not one voice in that town rose to stop it, because Silas Vane sat on the Whitlock Springs Vigilance Committee, and the committee, by then, did not merely enforce the law of the territory. It had become the law, the absence of any circuit judge willing to ride out that far more than twice a year. The chairman of that committee was a rancher named Josiah Croft, and understanding Josiah Croft is the whole key to understanding what happened to Temperance Holt. So we're going to sit with him a moment. Croft owned the largest spread in 3 counties, sat on the board of the one bank, and had personally financed the very jailhouse his own committee used to hold prisoners before what passed for trial out there. He gave generously to the church. He remembered the names of every rancher's children. He was, by every visible measure, the finest man in the territory, and men like that are dangerous specifically because no one thinks to look twice at them. Men in that country had a habit of taking a rancher's Sunday pew and his steady-handed auction as proof enough of his whole character, and Josiah Croft had built 11 patient years on exactly that habit, understanding better. He'd learned, since arriving in Whitlock Springs with money no one thought to question, that the fastest way to own a county was never to take it by force, but to be handed it piece by grateful piece, by people who mistook his generosity for the whole of his nature. What the town of Whitlock Springs did not know about Josiah Croft is that 11 years earlier, under a different name, in a mining camp 2 territories north, he had put a bullet through a business partner's chest, and made it plain to the one man who'd seen it happen that silence was the only coin that would keep him breathing. That witness took the coin. He rode out that same night and did not stop riding for a long, long while. His name, then and now, was Elias. Understand something about Elias before we go further, because the town of Whitlock Springs was about to misjudge him the same way every town before it had. He rode in quiet gray at the temples, though he wasn't yet 40, dressed in a coat the color of trail dust, and he wanted nothing but a stall for his horse and a room with a door that locked. Men who'd ridden with outfits from the Nations to the California line knew a different name for him, a name spoken low in saloons that had seen him work, a name that meant a man had made a very bad decision somewhere and had not lived long enough to regret it twice. But Elias had not gone by that name in 3 years. He had put the gun away, or convinced himself he had, and he drifted from territory to territory the way a man drifts when the one place he actually wants to be no longer exists, because the woman who'd made him want to stop killing for a living had died of a slow fever the winter before, in a cabin he'd bought her with money he was ashamed of. Unable to save her the way he'd once saved himself. Her name had been Mara, and she was the only person in a decade of hard living who had ever asked him without flinching, exactly how many men he'd killed and exactly why, and then chosen to stay, regardless, not because she approved of the answer. She had made him promise, the winter before the fever took her, that he'd try being an ordinary man for a while, see if it suited him better than the alternative ever had. He had kept that promise for 3 years out of something that felt less like virtue than grief with nowhere left to go, carrying her name folded away like a coat he no longer wore, waiting, without quite admitting it to himself, for a reason worth unfolding it again. He rode into Whitlock Springs on a Tuesday afternoon, expecting to spend one night and move on by morning. He rode in other words, on the same afternoon Silas Vane's body was found behind the mercantile, with a bullet in his chest, and a widow's name already forming on half the town's lips before the undertaker had finished his examination. Here is what actually happened the night Silas Vane died, and you should know it now, plainly, because the rest of this story is about who gets believed and who does not. Temperance Holt had gone to Vane's office that evening alone, against her own better judgment, to make one final plea or one final threat. She herself would later admit she wasn't entirely sure which. She had exactly enough saved to cover a third of it. She made clear to Vane that she would not marry him, would not sign, and would find the rest of the money if she had to sell every head of cattle she owned to strangers passing through. Vane laughed at her. He informed her, not unkindly, that strangers passing through wouldn't offer her half what the land was worth once he owned the paper on it outright, because he intended, he made plain, to be the only buyer left standing. She left his office furious, in tears, and this detail would hang her, almost literally. She left it holding his own letter opener, which she had picked up off his desk in the middle of the argument and forgotten was still in her hand until she was 3 streets away. She turned around to return it. That single decent impulse put her back near the mercantile at almost exactly the hour Silas Vane was shot from behind in the alley by someone who was never seen, someone who left no boot prints anyone bothered searching for, because by the time deputies arrived, Temperance Holt was already standing over the body with Vane's own letter opener still in her hand, having discovered him seconds after the real killer melted into the dark. She screamed. 2 men came running from the saloon. And that is the entire evidentiary case the Whitlock Springs Vigilance Committee required: a widow with a documented motive, a widow who had been heard threatening the man not 4 days prior in front of witnesses, standing over the body with a blade in her hand at the exact hour of the killing. No one paused to ask why a woman intending murder would use a dull letter opener when a bullet had done the actual work. No one thought to ask where the gun had gone, because no gun was ever found on her or anywhere near her, a fact the committee's own inquest simply declined to dwell on. Josiah Croft, as chairman, presided over that inquest personally, and Josiah Croft, more than anyone in the territory, understood exactly how a scene like that could be made to read whatever story its author wanted it to read. The trial, if 2 days of testimony before a committee panel with no defense counsel worth the name can be counted a trial, lasted from Thursday morning to Friday evening. Temperance Holt was permitted to speak in her own defense for exactly 6 minutes. She used every one of them to tell the truth, which by then had become a story too plain, too unglamorous, too lacking in villains anyone in that room was willing to name, to compete with the tidy narrative already circulating: desperate widow, cornered by debt, Hill's the man who held her note. The panel deliberated 40 minutes. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn on Saturday behind the jailhouse, On Gallows, the town carpenter had, with a coldness that still turns the stomach, begun building before the verdict was even formally read. That is the injustice sitting at the center of this story, and I want you to feel the whole weight of it before we go any further. A good woman, guilty of nothing but grief and a debt she did not choose, was about to be killed by a town too frightened, too comfortable, or too complicit to look past the story its most powerful man had handed them. And into that town on the very afternoon it happened rode a gray-headed stranger who had spent the last 11 years of his life running from the exact same crime, committed by the exact same hand. It would be easy, telling this from a comfortable distance, to make villains of every face in that gallery, and that would be its own kind of lie. Most of the people who filled the committee's benches that Thursday were not cruel by nature. They were tired, frightened of a territory that had already buried 11 souls to fever that same spring, and desperately wanted the killing of Silas Vane to have a simple answer they could close the book on before winter closed in behind it. A tidy story, however wrong, is easier for a frightened town to carry than an untidy truth, and Josiah Croft had spent 11 patient years learning exactly how to hand a frightened town the tidiest story available. Because Elias had seen the body. Travels fast in a town small enough to build its own gallows overnight, and by supper time half of Whitlock Springs had trooped past the alley behind the mercantile to gawk at the bloodstain before the undertaker hosed it down. Elias went too, not out of morbid curiosity, but because something in the way men were describing the wound, a single shot, close range from behind, staged to look almost incidental, had put a cold hand on the back of his neck that he hadn't felt in 3 years of trying to forget what that particular feeling meant. He looked at the angle of the blood spray. He looked at the position the body had reportedly been found in, which 2 loose-lipped deputies were happy to describe to anyone buying them a drink at the saloon that evening. And he recognized it the way a man recognizes his own handwriting on a letter he swore he never wrote. It was the same, not similar, the same. The same angle, the same distance, the same cold economy of motion that a man uses when killing, is not new to him, and has never once cost him a night's sleep. 11 years earlier, in a mining camp 2 territories north, Elias had watched a man named Josiah. He'd gone by a different surname then, put a bullet into a partner's chest from behind with that exact same unhurried precision. If Elias had been an ordinary drifter, he might have convinced himself it was coincidence and ridden out the next morning as planned. He was not an ordinary drifter. He had spent 11 years learning to read a killing the way other men read a brand on a steer, and every instinct trained into him by a life he was deeply ashamed of was screaming the same word at him that night. He inquired around carefully, using a stranger's easy small talk instead of a lawman's blunt questions, and within an hour he had confirmed it. The rancher everyone in Whitlock Springs knew as Josiah Croft was, beneath the respectable surname and the 11 years of distance, the same man who had once warned a 19-year-old gun for hire that silence was the only coin worth keeping. Now here is where I want to pause the story and ask you something directly, because it matters to how the rest of this plays out. If you've ever felt like there's one true thing you know that could change everything, but you're not sure anyone would believe it coming from you, stay with us, because Elias is about to face exactly that question, and the answer he chooses is the whole reason this story deserves telling. If you want more stories like this one, tap Join beside the channel name and become a member. It takes 10 seconds, and it's exactly what keeps this channel alive. Elias did not march into the jailhouse that first night and announce what he knew. Understand why? Because it isn't cowardice, even though it might look that way for a moment. A drifter with a gunfighter's reputation, riding into town on the very day a murder occurred, accusing the most powerful and beloved man in the county of that exact murder with no evidence but an old memory from a different territory 11 years past. That man gets himself hung alongside her by sundown the next day, dismissed as a lunatic, or worse, quietly disposed of before he can say another word, the way Croft had disposed of every inconvenient witness before. Elias understood something the town of Whitlock Springs had forgotten. That being right is worth nothing at all if you're dead before anyone has to listen. So he did the smaller, harder thing. Instead, he stayed. He took the room with the locking door and let the boy at the livery know he'd be in town a few extra days resting his horse. He walked the streets like any curious traveler, and he watched. He watched Josiah Croft receive condolences on the mercantile steps with a face arranged into exactly the right measure of grief. He watched two of Croft's hired men, not deputies, never officially deputies, just men who happened to always be near the jailhouse when Croft wanted eyes there, take shifts outside the cell where Temperance Holt sat waiting to die. And on his second evening in Whitlock Springs, walking past that same jailhouse a little after dark, he did the one small thing that would end up changing the shape of everything that followed. One of Croft's men, a broad, thick-necked hand named Purdy, was leaning against the jailhouse wall taunting the prisoner through the cell's single-barred window. The kind of low, ugly talk men use when they've decided a person is already as good as dead and therefore no longer worth treating like one. Elias did not know Temperance Holt's name yet. He did not know her story beyond the rough shape the whole town already knew. What he knew, standing there in the dark, was that a man 3 times her size was tormenting a woman in a locked cage the night before she was to be killed, and something in him, the part that had put the gun away 3 years ago and convinced himself he was done being the kind of man who let cruelty happen in front of him, would not let that stand. He didn't draw on Purdy. That would have drawn exactly the attention he could not afford. He simply walked up, leaned against the wall beside him with the easy, unhurried manner of a man passing time, and asked conversationally whether Purdy's mother knew he spent his evenings frightening women who couldn't fight back. It was a small thing, almost nothing, 3 sentences and a look that made a big man suddenly aware of how alone he was in the dark, with a stranger whose stillness didn't sit right. Purdy sputtered something about it being none of a drifter's business, and found a reason to be somewhere else. Through the bars, in the dim light, Temperance Holt got her first look at the man who had just, without knowing her name or her circumstances, quietly stepped between her and cruelty for no reason at all. She had learned over 2 years of Silas Vane's visits not to trust kindness from strange men, and she told him so, plainly through the bars, that she didn't need defending by someone who'd get bored of the notion by morning and ride on like everyone else in this territory eventually did. Elias didn't argue with her. He only said that he wasn't planning on riding anywhere just yet, and that she should get what rest she could, because she'd need her strength. Then he walked back to the boarding house and sat up most of the night with a bottle he didn't drink from, turning the whole problem over in his mind like a man turning over a stone to see what's living underneath it. The problem, plainly stated, was this: he had a memory, and memories hang no one. He needed proof, or as close to proof as a corrupt committee town would ever recognize, and he had roughly 3 days to find it before Temperance Holt was dead, and the truth died quietly, along with her, the way it had died quietly for 11 years already, in a mining camp 2 territories north. The next morning he began, carefully, to make himself useful in a town that didn't yet know it needed him. He offered to help the livery owner with a lame horse and, while he worked, posed easy questions about the town's history, how long Croft had been chairman, where he'd come from before Whitlock Springs, whether anyone remembered him arriving. The livery owner, glad of the company and the free labor, talked freely. Croft had shown up 11 years back alone, with enough capital to buy out the old Meacham spread outright in cash, which had struck people as odd at the time. A stranger with that kind of money arriving from nowhere, though the peculiarity of it had long since been smoothed over by a decade of good behavior. 11 years. The number sat in Elias's chest like a stone dropped down a well, the splash arriving a long time after the drop. 11 years since a mining partner named Coleman had died with a stolen pistol in his hand in a camp 2 territories north, and 11 years since a stranger with a dead man's cash had arrived in Whitlock Springs to build a new name on top of an old crime. It was not proof a committee panel would accept, but it was a thread, and Elias had learned in his old life that you pull threads quietly, one at a time, until the whole coke comes apart in your hands. He found the second thread in the mercantile itself, of all places, where Silas Vane's clerk, a nervous, unremarkable young man named Fenn, who had worked the counter for 3 years and clearly hadn't slept since his employer's death. Elias bought tobacco he didn't need, and in the unhurried way of a man with nowhere else to be, got Fenn talking. It came out in pieces the way real truths usually do, that 2 weeks before he died, Silas Vane had come into a large amount of cash he hadn't explained, that he'd told Fenn, half joking, that Josiah Croft had finally agreed to buy him out of the water rights business, for a sum that would let Vane retire east within the year, and that Vane had seemed, in his last days, less like a man circling a widow for her land, and more like a man who believed he was about to become considerably richer than 80 acres of grays could ever make him. Water rights. Elias had heard the phrase twice now, without understanding its weight, until he rode out that afternoon along the northern boundary of the Holt Ranch, and found what any careful man would have found looking for it. The spring-fed creek that watered both the Holt spread and Croft's much larger operation ran entirely through Temperance Holt's 80 acres. Before it ever reached Croft land, and had done so since long before Thomas Holt bought the place. It was, Elias realized, standing at the water's edge with the whole shape of it, finally coming clear. Never really about a debt at all. It was about a widow sitting, without knowing it, on the one piece of paper that controlled the water for half of Croft's grazing land. Vane had held her note, but Croft had wanted her land, and once Vane discovered how valuable that particular 80 acres truly was and tried to cut himself a bigger piece of the deal for delivering it, Croft had done to Silas Vane exactly what he'd done to a mining partner 11 years earlier, and left someone else to hang for it. Now Elias had a motive to lay beside the memory and a pattern to lay beside the motive. What he still did not have, with less than 40 hours remaining before the gallows, was anything resembling a witness or a confession or a single piece of paper Croft himself had signed his own name to. And that is exactly the point in a story like this one, where the smart, careful plan, quiet questions, patient threads, evidence gathered like a man building a case brick by brick, runs headlong into a clock that does not care how careful you've been. Josiah Croft, for his part, had noticed the stranger. Of course he had. A man in Croft's position had not survived 11 years of rebuilding himself from nothing by failing to notice strangers who posed easy questions in exactly the wrong places. He'd had Purdy report the humiliation at the jailhouse, omitting, out of pride, the details that made him look foolish, and he'd had another man watch the livery conversation from a discreet distance. By Thursday evening, one full day before the hanging, Josiah Croft had decided the gray drifter needed to be measured, and men in his position measured other men the way they measured horses, by putting them to a test and watching how they broke. He sent word by way of Purdy, phrased as an invitation rather than a summons, that Josiah Croft would be obliged for the pleasure of the newcomer's company at his ranch house that evening. Elias understood the invitation for exactly what it was, and he accepted it anyway, because a man who wants to find out how much you know will often tell you without meaning to. Croft's ranch house sat on a rise a mile outside town, built large and handsome in a way that announced money without quite announcing where the money had first come from. Croft received him on the porch himself, poured 2 glasses of good whiskey neither of them drank much of, and made easy conversation about cattle prices and the coming winter for almost 20 minutes before he finally ventured that he understood the stranger had taken an interest in the unfortunate business with the widow Holt. Elias answered carefully, the way a man answers when he's decided the other man already suspects the truth and is only testing whether he'll lie about it. He said he'd simply been a passer-by who didn't care for watching a woman tormented in a cage. Nothing more, a small kindness, easily explained, easily forgiven by anyone with a conscience. Croft studied him a long moment over the rim of his glass, the porch lamp throwing his face half into shadow, and left something Elias would turn over in his mind for the rest of that night. He said that Whitlock Springs was a town that took very good care of men who minded their own business, and considerably less good care of men who did not, and that he hoped, sincerely, that a traveler with no stake in this county's affairs, it was not a threat spoken in any words a court could hang a man for. It did not need to be. Elias had heard that particular register of voice before 11 years earlier, standing over a dead man in a mining camp, and he understood precisely what Josiah Croft was offering him, a clean exit, a closed mouth, and a continued pulse. And precisely on the condition that he take the first road out of Whitlock Springs before sunrise. He rode back toward town slowly, the whole weight of the choice sitting on him the way it had sat on him 11 years before, except that this time the fear that had kept him silent then, a woman he loved, held hostage by the mere fact of Croft knowing her name, no longer existed to silence him. Taken by a fever no gun could have stopped, and Elias had nothing left in this world that Josiah Croft could threaten to take from him. He had spent 3 years believing, riding back into Whitlock Springs under a hard, cold spread of stars, with less than a day left before a rope closed around an innocent woman's neck. He understood for the first time that it made him. He went to the jailhouse. It was near midnight, the single guard dozing in a chair by the stove, and Elias woke him with a coin and a lie about wanting to leave provisions for the prisoner. Before he moved on in the morning, exactly the kind of small, unthreatening mercy no guard in a sleepy town thinks twice about permitting. Alone at the bars in the near dark, he finally told Temperance Holt his name and then walked her through everything else, the mining camp, the stolen pistol, the 11 years of silence, the water rights, Silas Vane's sudden cash, Josiah Croft's porch, and his very precise, very courteous threat not 2 hours old. She listened without interrupting him once, which he would later think was the single bravest thing he witnessed in the whole affair, because a woman with less than a full day to live, hearing a stranger explain the entire architecture of the lie that was about to kill her, would have every right to fall apart. She did not. She asked him, when he finished, the only question that actually mattered, whether he intended to tell anyone else what he knew, or whether he'd come simply to unburden his own conscience before riding out at dawn. That question sat in the dark between them a long moment, and Temperance, watching his face in the little light the guard stove threw down the hall, understood something about this quiet, gray-templed stranger before he ever managed to reply aloud, that he had already decided, and that the deciding had cost him something enormous, and that, whatever answer came next, was going to reorder the rest of both their lives, whether either of them was ready for it or not. He told her he intended to stop the hanging, one way or another, even if it meant standing in front of the whole town and saying a name that had kept him running for 11 years. He warned her he could not promise the town would believe him, that a stranger's word against Josiah Croft's 11 years of good standing was a poor wager, by any honest reckoning, but that he would rather be shot dead in the town square telling the truth than ride away one more time and let another innocent person pay for Croft's sins. Coleman already had, unremembered, in a mining camp no one in this territory had ever heard of. Something in the plain, unpolished honesty of that answer reached her in a way none of Silas Vane's practiced courtship ever had, and for the first time since her arrest, Temperance Holt allowed herself to believe, cautiously, that she might actually live to see Sunday. He left her with one more thing before the guard stirred, and he had to go a question of his own, quietly raised about who else in town might know something useful, anyone Vane had confided in besides the clerk Fenn. Anyone with a grudge against Croft old enough and deep enough to risk speaking against him. She gave him one name. Her late husband's cousin, a rough, half-forgotten prospector named Ezra Boone, who lived alone up in the hills and had once, years back, done some work for Croft up north before falling out with him bitterly over unpaid wages. Elias rode out before first light, not toward the main road as Croft would have expected, but up into the hills, chasing one last thread with less than 18 hours left on the clock, because a man like Ezra Boone, estranged from Croft and holding an old grudge, was exactly the kind of loose end that a careful killer usually forgets to account for. He found Boone's cabin by mid-morning, a squat, weathered thing tucked into a fold of rock, with a rifle already leveled at him before he'd even dismounted, which made clear to Elias exactly the kind of reception. It took the better part of an hour, and the mention of Coleman's name, a name Boone recognized instantly, going pale under his weathered tan, before the old prospector lowered the rifle and invited him inside. Boone had indeed worked that same mining camp 11 years before on the crew one ridge over from Coleman's claim, and he remembered with the sharp clarity men reserve for the one thing that has haunted them for over a decade, seeing a young man calling himself Josiah, no surname yet, not back then, leaving Coleman's tent late one night looking, in Boone's exact words, like a man who'd just done something he intended never to speak of again. Boone hadn't seen the killing itself, but he had seen Croft leave, and he had heard the next morning that Coleman was dead with a gun in his own hand that everyone in camp knew for a fact he'd never owned. It was not, on its own, a confession. It was not, by the strict letter of any court, proof. But it was a second man, entirely independent of Elias, entirely unknown to Croft as still being alive, and, within writing distance, prepared to say under oath that Josiah Croft had a documented history, 11 years old, one territory over, but a history all the same, of killing a partner and staging the scene to point elsewhere. And a man willing to swear to a pattern is worth more in front of a frightened town looking for a reason to doubt what it has already decided than a stranger's memory alone could ever be. Boone agreed to ride back with him. He owed Coleman that much, he said, quietly packing what little he needed, and he'd carried the weight of his own silence long enough that the idea of finally setting it down seemed, in that moment, almost like relief. They rode hard and reached the outskirts of Whitlock Springs a little after 4 in the afternoon, with darkness still hours off and the hanging set for dawn, which left them, Elias calculated grimly, exactly one night to turn 2 men's testimony befront of Josiah Croft himself, before the trap door beneath Temperance Holt's feet ever had the chance to open. We're close now to the moment this whole story has been building toward, and before we get there, I want to say one more thing directly to you. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't really a story about a hanging. It's a story about the cost of staying silent, and what it finally takes for one person to stop paying that cost. Before we get to the truth Elias risked everything to tell, tap the join button beside our channel name and become a member. It's genuinely how we keep telling stories like Temperance's. Elias did not go to the town marshal, because the town marshal deferred, in every practical sense, to the committee, and the committee in turn bowed to Josiah Croft. He did not go to the committee panel directly, because a private appeal made quietly the night before an execution could simply be buried, the way every inconvenient truth in Whitlock Springs had apparently been buried for 11 years running. Instead, he did the one thing Croft could not control. He made certain the whole town would be watching when the truth was finally voiced aloud, in the open, at the one moment Croft himself could not avoid attending without it looking, to every eye present. He spent that last night moving quietly between the handful of people who might listen, the livery owner, who remembered Croft's strange cash arrival 11 years back and was willing, reluctantly, to repeat it in daylight, the clerk Fenn, terrified but decent underneath the fear. Hardest one of all, the young deputy who'd been guarding Temperance's cell, a decent boy named Walt, who had never much liked how the trial was conducted and who agreed, after a long and difficult conversation on the jailhouse steps, that he would not raise his rifle against a stranger, simply trying to get the truth heard before an innocent woman died for want of it. The last hours of that night crawled by the way only the last hours before a hanging can. Somewhere in town, a dog barked itself hoarse at nothing, and finally quit. The hangman, who had never wanted the job and had inherited it only because he owned the one length of rope in the county rated for the weight, sat up half the night oiling the trapdoor hinges so they wouldn't stick, and hated himself a little more with every drop of oil. Elias did not sleep at all. He spent the dark hours moving between the livery owner's cabin and Fenn's room above the mercantile, gathering the last of what he needed, running the whole fragile chain of it over in his mind again and again, looking for the weak link Croft would surely find first if given even one more hour to look for it himself. Dawn came the way. Dawn always comes in that country, indifferent and beautiful, a hard gold light spilling low across the hills, as though the whole territory hadn't spent the night deciding whether to kill an innocent woman by sunup. The town gathered early, the way towns always gather for a hanging, a crowd that was equal parts grim, duty and unspoken shame, because plenty of those faces in that crowd had watched Silas Vane corner Temperance Holt for 2 years and stayed silent, and plenty of them knew, somewhere under the story they'd agreed to believe, that something about the whole affair had never quite sat right. Temperance Holt was marched out at first light between 2 of the committee's men, her hands bound, her chin held level in a way that cost her, everyone watching could see, everything she had left to give. She had decided somewhere in the last sleepless hours that, if this was truly to be her last morning, the town of Whitlock Springs would not get the satisfaction of watching her break. She climbed the scaffold steps herself, refusing the hand offered to steady her, and stood beneath the crossbeam while the hangman, an unhappy, conscripted local man who plainly wanted no part of this, checked the rope with hands that visibly shook. Josiah Croft stood at the front of the crowd in his best coat, exactly where a chairman was expected to stand, his face composed into an expression of solemn civic duty that had by now fooled this town for over a decade. He was, in fact, the very picture of grief and reluctant justice, right up until the moment a gray-templed stranger walked out of the crowd and up to the base of the scaffold steps and asked, in a voice pitched to carry to every corner of that silent square, whether the chairman would care to explain to his town exactly how he'd come by the money that bought the old Meacham spread 11 years ago. On the very same week, a mining partner named Coleman turned up dead 2 territories north with a gun in his hand that had never belonged to him. The square went silent in the particular way a crowd goes silent when it senses, before it can even name why, that the ground it's standing on has just shifted. Croft recovered fast. He was, after all, a man who had built an entire life on recovering fast, and demanded to know who this drifter thought he was, interrupting lawful proceedings with wild accusations. It was, Elias would later admit, a genuinely good performance, indignant and wounded in exactly the right measure, and for one terrible moment he watched it work on the crowd, watched sympathy start to swing back toward the man in the fine coat. That was the moment Ezra Boone stepped out of the crowd beside him. The old prospector's voice was rougher than Elias's, less practiced, but it carried its own kind of weight, the weight of a man who had clearly not wanted to be there, had clearly not wanted to say what he was about to say, and was saying it anyway, because the alternative had finally become worse than the fear. He told the whole square in plain, unpolished words what he had seen 11 years earlier in that mining camp. A young man calling himself Josiah, leaving a dead partner's tent in the dark, looking like a man who'd just done murder. And a story the whole camp was later fed about a suicide that not one soul who'd actually known Coleman ever believed for a moment. It was the livery owner who spoke next, unprompted, his voice unsteady but clear, confirming that yes, now that he thought hard on it, Josiah Croft had indeed arrived in this county 11 years back with an unusual amount of cash for a man claiming to have nothing. Cash he'd never fully explained even to his oldest friends in town. And it was Finn, the terrified young clerk, hand shaking so badly he nearly dropped it, who produced Silas Vane's ledger and read aloud, in a cracking voice, the entry from 2 weeks before the murder. Settlement, water rights, Holt parcel, signed with Josiah Croft's initials beside it. Croft's composure did not shatter all at once. It went the way a dam goes, a hairline crack widening under pressure no single piece of testimony alone could have caused, but that 4 separate threads, arriving together in front of the whole town at once, finally tore open. He tried, still, to talk his way past it, tried to call the ledger a forgery, and the prospector a bitter old liar settling an ancient grudge, and for a moment it might even have worked, except that Deputy Walt, the boy who'd guarded Temperance's cell and hated every hour of it, quietly, but clearly enough for the front rows to hear, that he had personally searched the alley behind the Mercantile the morning after Vane's death, and found boot prints leading away from the body that matched no shoe Temperance Holt owned, boot prints he had reported to the committee that very week. That was the thread that finished it. Because Walt was not a drifter with an old grudge or a memory from a distant territory, Walt was this town's own boy, the son of the blacksmith, a deputy the whole square had known since he was a child. And when he stood in front of Josiah Croft and said the committee had buried evidence, the town of Whitlock Springs finally, all at once, stopped believing the story it had spent a week agreeing to. What happened next happened fast, the way real violence always does after too much waiting. Croft, seeing the crowd's face finally turn, seeing 11 years of careful reinvention come apart in front of him in the space of 5 minutes, did what a cornered man like him had always done when reinvention stopped working. Purdy, standing near enough to see it, reached for his own weapon a half-second later, torn between 11 years of loyalty to his employer and the sudden sick understanding of exactly what he'd been loyal to. Elias moved before either finished the motion. He had put the gun away for 3 years, believed himself done being that particular kind of fast, and in the one moment it mattered most, his body remembered anyway, drawing and firing a single shot that took the pistol clean out of Croft's hand before it ever cleared leather. The crack of it echoing off the square's false front buildings and leaving Josiah Croft standing there, gripping a bloodied, empty hand, whole, alive, and utterly undone. No one else fired. Purdy, staring at Elias's steady, still-leveled pistol and at the ruin of his employer's composure, thought better of it and let his own gun drop into the dust at his feet, done in that instant with a loyalty that had never once been worth the price of it. And Josiah Croft, chairman of the Whitlock Springs Vigilance Committee, the finest man in 3 counties, sank slowly onto the scaffold steps of the very gallows he had built for someone else's crime. And the town of Whitlock Springs stood in the hard gold morning light and finally, fully understood exactly what it had almost done. Temperance Holt, still standing beneath the crossbeam with the rope not yet removed from around her neck, watched all of it happen with a stillness that would stay with everyone present for the rest of their lives, not triumph, not yet. Only the particular blank shock of a person who has spent a full night preparing to die and is only now beginning to understand that she isn't going to. It was Elias who climbed the scaffold steps to loosen the rope himself. His hands, she would tell him later, shaking harder in that moment than they had at any point in the entire ordeal, and it was Elias who found the only words either of them managed in that first minute, quiet, plain meant for her alone even with the whole square watching. That he was sorry it had taken him this long to say what he should have voiced 11 years ago, and that he was grateful, more than he knew how to put into words, that he'd finally been in the right place to say it in time. The formal reckoning that followed took the better part of a month, and I'll spare you the full accounting of it because the truth of a story like this one rarely lies in the paperwork. Josiah Croft was tried a real trial this time, with a circuit judge finally summoned, and both Boone's and Walt's sworn testimony entered properly into record, along with a wire sent north confirming that a man matching Croft's description had indeed vanished from that same mining camp. He was convicted of the murder of Silas Vane, and eventually of a second murder 11 years old and 1 territory away. And Whitlock Springs, to its credit, did not flinch from the reckoning once it finally had all the pieces in front of it. The committee itself was dissolved within the year, replaced by an actual elected marshal answering to an actual judge, which is, in its own quiet way, as much a part of this story's ending. Temperance Holt kept the ranch. That matters, so let it land. She did not sell it, did not marry it away to the next man who came calling with a note in his hand, did not lose 1 acre of the 80 her husband had built with his own 2 hands. The water rights that had nearly gotten her killed became, instead, the thing that finally made the Holt Ranch worth more than Silas Vane's note had ever claimed it was. And Temperance, sharper now and harder to fool in the particular way a person becomes after surviving what she'd survived, negotiated a fair, honest arrangement with her neighbors for shared use of the creek that no one in that county ever dared cross her on again. As for Elias, he did not ride out the next morning the way he'd first planned to, nor the morning after that. He told himself at first that he was staying only long enough to give his testimony properly, to see Croft's trial through to its end, to make certain the truth he'd carried 11 years finally had somewhere solid to rest. But testimony doesn't take a season, and a season is roughly how long it took before the whole town of Whitlock Springs simply stopped expecting him to leave, and roughly how long it took before Temperance Holt stopped expecting it too, and started, instead. Ezra Boone stayed on too, in his own fashion, riding down out of the hills more often than anyone would have predicted of a man so allergic to company, until he'd more or less made himself the Holt Ranch's second hand without either of them formally asking him to. Deputy Walt got his badge made proper and permanent under the new elected marshal, the first honest law Whitlock Springs had seen in over a decade, and he liked to tell newcomers with a little more pride each year that he'd been the one who finally cracked the case open in front of the whole square, which was true enough in its way. That nobody in town ever bothered correcting him. Theirs was not a courtship built on grand declarations. It was built the way real things get built out on that hard, unforgiving land, slowly, through fence mended together and cattle moved together, and long silences on a porch that neither of them felt any need to fill. 2 people who had each spent years carrying a weight alone, finally discovering what it felt like to set part of it down in front of someone who understood exactly how heavy it had been. He never fully told her every detail of the life he'd lived before he put the gun away, and she never pressed him to. Some coats, a person earns the right to leave, folded at the bottom of a trunk. What she did ask him one evening the following spring, sitting on the same porch where she'd once refused Silas Vane over cold tea, was whether a man who'd spent so many years running from his past might finally consider staying still for a while in a house with a woman who no longer had any interest in facing the rest of her life alone. He stayed. The town of Whitlock Springs, which had so nearly hanged an innocent woman on the word of its most trusted liar, got instead the quiet lasting proof that the truth, even carried 11 years too long in silence, will still find its way to daylight if one person finally decides that staying quiet has cost enough. Temperance Holt kept her name, her land, and eventually added Elias's beside it on a new deed. Neither of them ever had cause to defend before a committee again, and the gray drifter who rode into town one Tuesday afternoon, expecting to stay a single night, ended up in the end exactly where he was always meant to be. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us putting it together, do us one favor before you go. Subscribe if you haven't already, and tell us in the comments which moment landed hardest for you, because we genuinely read every one of them. And if Temperance and Elias earned a place in your evening, share this one with somebody who loves a story like it. That's the best thing you can do for a small channel trying to grow.